Well, somebody said they wanted me to hold forth for 45 minutes, and I said, no way. I'm very glad this moved, because I thought there would be some people showing up this morning. It did remind me, though, when I went to the little place across the museum, and it was dark, of the old experience I had many years ago. When I was 11, my parents moved to Pittsburgh, but I found them. I feel very humble this morning because for the first time in probably the whole experience I've had on this road, I want to sit and listen more than I want to talk. I was very upset at myself that I had to miss a lot of yesterday against my will because there were these agonizing decisions. As you are well aware, there is other stuff going on in town this weekend. And television is in town, network television, sci-fi. And they're very nice people. They have done some very important things with the Roswell site, with the crash, with the archaeology. Bill Dolman came down. We live very close to each other now. He's at the university, I'm at the other end of town. They want me to contribute some ideas for how to analyze the stuff they found. And we have some really interesting ideas, I hope, about a different approach that will parallel the lab data. The mainstream guys had their ways of doing things. My take has been, if we're really dealing with an extraterrestrial thing, it will have an extraterrestrial signature. We're going to look for the hyperdimensional signature. And we've got some really cool tests, and what they're going to give us is big labs and money to play with. So it was this agonizing, do I go and listen to David, whose book I've already read cover to cover before it was a book, or do I stay out here in the broiling hot sun with the tarantulas and continue this process so we get more information? And obviously I decided on staying out. Plus there was one other little thing. You know, the devil made me do it. When they did the dig, they tried to figure out where the thing came down and bounced, like skipping a stone across water. It's called the skip site, which, if that's true, if it really did do a touch and go and then crashed 20, 30 miles beyond, that tells us something really interesting about what this thing was and the laws of physics under which it was operating that night. So I'm out there, looking and measuring and talking, and we actually hung back with the rest of the group after everybody else had kind of left. We were very fortunate. I mean, this is where providence comes in, or as you would say, meaningful coincidence and synchronicity, because we were going to caravan out there, and there were too many people for too few cars, and so we wound up kind of being shuffled around, and they put Robin and myself in a car with two total strangers, who just happened to be the two most important people that we could have ever connected with. They were Chuck and Debbie, who did the volunteer digging, and so we had 4 or 5 hours of conversation in a little Jeep going and coming about all the background stuff that no one got to hear about the dig, and who did what, who found what. And anyway, Deborah and Chuck had found something, and I think that may be the most important thing we're going to get to analyze. It is so cool. It has all the attributes of the thing we've been looking for. And I sat next to Bill last night at dinner, which is why I didn't get a chance to come to dinner with you guys. And he admitted that this is very interesting. He then said, you and I need to get together to talk about the tests. He says, you've got some interesting ideas. So it's all part of how do you get from ignorance to some version of knowledge which is on the road to truth. In science, there is no such thing as absolute truth, as Mike will obviously attest. It's a constant winnowing down of the errors, of the uncertainties, to where it's narrower and narrower and narrower, and you kind of see that the path is converging to something you can hang your hat on. So this, to me, this weekend has been a study in process. Because initially I came down with this lady right here. This is Paula Harris. Come on, Paula, stand up, stand up. Famous, well-known international director. Who lives at home and hangs out with the Pope and all that good stuff. You know, she has dinners with Balducci, who has said, as you may or may not know, that they know a lot more than they're letting on, and she keeps trying to arrange for me to come over there and have some conversations. So when she wrote me the email a few months ago, it's done. It being the book. Do we have a copy of the book with you? We don't? You can see she's totally not commercial about this. I have to, yes, she's doing her journalist thing, okay. Anyway, during the break, we'll go and we'll get a copy of the book so you can see her book, because I want you to read her book. She's done a meticulous job of documenting all the strange and flaky people who have gotten involved in this and their journeys. And this is a lot about journeys. It's a lot about how we seek, each of us individually, for truth. And there are lots of roads to Rome, as someone once said, right? So anyway, she lives there. So she said, you know, I'm going to be coming out with a book, and I'm going to be in Roswell signing. And I said, I've never been to Roswell. I've lived here now since '97 in New Mexico. Never been to Roswell. I want to be part of the zoo and all that. '97, I wanted to be on Alpha Centauri because of all the nonsense that was going on. Plus, we had Pathfinder going to Mars. That was an interesting decision. So I finally said, okay, we got our reason we're going to go to Roswell to support Paula, our dear friend. Then things started happening. It's like we had moved, and his manuscript showed up in a box. Just, oh, okay. So I opened it, started to read, kept reading. And then Mike and I, who've been in touch by email, he says, well, I'm going to Roswell. Huh? What? You're going to Roswell? Do you know something I don't know? Anyway, so then it turned out that the guy was doing this thing, and I sent an email to Guy, and he said, well, you know, would you like to talk to me on Sunday morning? We're having a panel. You know, it's like an old fire horse. Can't turn down an invitation to talk on a panel. So, and I haven't been up this early on a Sunday morning since Father Donnelly said I'd go to hell if I didn't. Okay, so I want you to be very respectful. Anyway, so Mike was going to do this thing, and then he said, well, why don't we get together when I come through Albuquerque? I think you mumbled something about seeing Enterprise, but I don't think the nerve center. Yeah. Is that working?
Hello?
The nerve center, yeah. Anyway, so then my friend Paul Davids, who is the Hollywood producer who did the Roswell movie and a whole bunch of other stuff, he calls up and he says, we're coming through Albuquerque on the way to Roswell. Can we come and see the new house? Oh, and I'm bringing 2 friends from Hollywood. Huh? So that started Wednesday. And then it turned out that Larry Landsman, who is the special projects guy at Sci-Fi, just was going to be in town. And so it's all because we just started out to be here for our friend. One thing has led to another, has led to another, has led to another. What it is a quintessential example of what happens in life if you stay open. If you don't close off your options. If you don't make the artificial decision, life has to be this way. And to me, the exciting thing about what we're doing, the journeys we're on, is that if you keep those options open, whether you want to call it God or providence or synchronicity or serendipity, whatever term you want to put on it, it will lead you in interesting and important directions. Let me close with this. One thing you got to do is to keep looking down, though. Because as Chuck drives to the next site out there, they had put in a series of huge kind of railroad spikes on steroids to mark the skip path. And I, of course, in a huge desert of several thousand square miles, find the one with my left toe that they didn't take out of the ground. So I am hobbling a bit, not because I'm getting old, but because I'm getting stupid. You Look down when you're in the desert. Anyway, thanks for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to a very interesting morning.
I know that start moving the questions along. And as Richard said, that's pretty much the way it happened. I'm sitting there on the other end going, boy, this is kind of weird. That all these things are happening as he described it. A lot, of course, I didn't know. But between he and myself, how it has just evolved and gone along, and directions things have taken. I know those of us who were here for the conference, and we've talked about this various times over the last couple of days, and we're really quite pleased that everything has come together as it has. This is about, this morning, an exchange of ideas, and just a conversation between us, between you, question and answer. As Richard said, we're all going to have differences of opinion. Even those of us within the conference, the original scheduled presenters, you probably gathered this by yourself already. I mean, there are divergences of opinion here, so no one is endorsing anybody else's views. We want to talk, we want to answer, we want to listen, question, and hopefully it'll stimulate questions in you. The questions you ask will stimulate us to think. I know that's happened to me already several times. So with that being said, Dave, I know, has a list of questions. I see Chris with a list of questions. I don't know who they're for, but Dave, why don't you fire away and ask what you like.
I actually don't have any questions. I have some comments.
Okay.
You were talking about the synchronicity of how you ended up here, and I was thinking how interesting it plays into what I kind of discovered put in the book, the spiritual occult components to history and the terrestrial connection between Mars and this Earth. And finding that repeated over and over again seems to be the theme that I ended up with. It actually is still in play. And I opened my talk yesterday about these topics by looking at Neoplatonists, Neo-Pythagoreans, people that actually availed themselves of the annals of the history before them. And we're able to kind of find these patterns and say there's some force out there that's guiding us, inexorably to this point. And I see it really in action right now. And I was just wondering if you've ever, contemplated something like that, almost a Neoplatonist theurgy going on.
I have a different name for it, and it has to do with the experience base of the path that we've been on for, as I said, 20 generation. I can't believe I've been doing this for 20 years. When we started looking at Sidonia, the first questions I had, by the way, hold up that time, hold up the cover. This is really an important work. You got to read it. It's got some problems, got some errors. We're going to fix them. The publisher rushed out without doing the proper checking, but we're going to fix them. But this is an important document. David has done a tremendously important piece of work here. And I'm hoping that when the errors are fixed, that it will be strong enough to withstand good intellectual criticism and move this debate beyond the is it real or is it Memorex into the what is it trying to say? Because the meaning of Sidonia to me has always been where it's at. If this really happened, if there really are a set of ancient ruins on the next planet out from the sun, whose centerpiece is a thing that looks like us, kind of, that is telling us in several different languages, in we wink, that somehow we're involved. Whether you're coming at it from the God and man in God's image, or you're coming at it from the evolutionary biologists like Gaylord Simpson, who claimed that if you toss the dice again, you'd never create us randomly on this planet. Whatever approach you take, the roads to Rome narrow down to where that thing should not be there unless it has some profound message for the human race. that is a starting point. We then were led into the geometries that help us prove that it's not just a random pile of rocks. And then we found in those geometries, they're not just any old geometries, they're a specific geometry, which is kind of a code, although not a deliberate code. It's just the inevitability of expressing certain precepts in a mathematical language, which turns out to be a key to a doorway, to a whole new way of looking at the universe. Now, when I say whole new, new in the 20th century or 21st, but it turns out that our 19th century brethren were beginning very seriously to look at physics and reality through that doorway, and something happened. It's like we took this left-hand turn, and we went off into relativity land and Einstein. That doesn't seem to be ultimately where we want to be, because that doesn't describe the whole enchilada. I can say that in Mexico, right? Whole enchilada. Okay. It's what? Okay. So, when you ask me the question, we started out looking at this geometry as a key to a physics that would relate to stuff. You know, what happens when I release this? It doesn't break, okay. It falls, right? But then, the next step was, what if this physics also is part of us? If it's somehow intricately intertwined with consciousness, with our physical presence in this dimension, with what we do, what choices are presented. In other words, Jung called this set of coincidences that show up every once in a while synchronicities. He called it meaningful coincidence. I'm beginning to think that that is intimately connected with a phenomenon over in physics we call resonance. You know, we have a lot of language. Language is very much part of structuring how we think, as this guy would tell you. And if you don't transcend your language or understand what your language is constraining you to think, you'll never get out of the box. You'll never think the unthinkable. And a lot of what we're up here all talking about is the unthinkable for most people. I mean, when I told him that I was invited years ago to be on the 700 Club, he could not believe that. I've got the tape, so I will make a copy and I will send it to you. So thinking out of the box, if this physics is as important and as big as I think it is after spending a lot of years doing the thinking about it, it, to me, is another potential explanation for why when you get on the right wavelength and you're open, when you can go with the flow, as a California term used to be, things happen. Because it's about resonance. It's about, I mean, there are two qualities of vibration. There's dissonance, which is the fingernails on the blackboard. Just thinking about it is bad. And then there's resonance. Think of Gregorian chants. Think of monks with huge bells in Thailand. Think of choruses. Think of, I mean, resonance in the musical aspect of it does something to us. That's why great music is great. It's more than just art appreciation. It's internalized. It's in resonance with our very being. So, looking at the physics of resonance, and again, we're talking the malleability of language here. Whether you call it God or you call it resonance, the end product is, if you're open, it will guide you in an interesting direction. Most people, though, are not open. They think they've got a pre-plan where they're going to be on Tuesday in 2008. No, that's not the way to enjoy it and to get something out of it. It's to surf the wave in a way that you keep watching. Like yesterday, we went to the site, and I've got all this mythology about the Roswell crash, right? Read all the books, I know a lot of the folks, I've talked about it endlessly with people. I get out there, and I'm
you should.
But, well, we're in the process of checking, right? But so far, I know I came back to town, I spent a lot of the evening checking some of this stuff, and yes, no one seems to understand what that means. No one had even noticed it in a way of asking the meaning of what it means. That's because these people apparently have had so many preconceptions that they never just kind of looked around and said, that's weird, that doesn't fit. And what we do as scientists is to look at the things that don't fit. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that as Einstein said, the real process of science, where it begins, is in wonder, is in asking the right questions and being open. And from other perspectives, from the perspective of belief, or living the right kind of life, there's the same foundation as I think, because life works when you're open. End of sermon. Sunday.
I'll tell you. Yeah. I'll tell you what I've been really struck by between the work of both of you, and that is, you talk about being open and these preconceptions, conceptions, so on and so forth. I was really struck yesterday with Dave's presentation that, again, I confess I'm an astronomy bonehead. I don't know much about precession, but it just seems to me, I do know patterns when I see them. I'm not blind. And I'm struck not only by the frequency and the depth of the patterns in both Richard's work and Dave's, but what really kind of hit me was, as far as an analog, an earthly analog, that is word specific. The whole idea of Sidonia and Sidon, you're only going to find this in the Old Testament. This component of this pattern. And there were a few things that Dave said that I just had never really thought of. And when we talk about language, if you're an academic, you're taught certain rules of language. I'm not going to poo-poo the rules of language, because language has rules, just like a computer program, a computer language. It makes communication possible. It's not just random and chaotic and disordered and so on and so forth. But I also think that this rubric is true, and it's sort of becoming a self-mantra with me that the text can mean more than what it says at face value, but it can't mean less. To make it less means to make it meaningless. You strip away any sense of objectivity. As linguists, we're taught certain rules of etymology, we're taught rules of grammar, we're taught rules of syntax. And so if a linguist who was not open would come here and listen to Richard or Dave, and they're talking about sound similarities, word similarities, and they're not just incidental. Some of these are whole words, whole phrases, that kind of thing. An unopened linguist would say, "Oh, this is just ridiculous. We need to see a linguistic history documented text, all the way down to this." And I'm saying, well, I think you're requiring a little bit too much of the material. There's nothing wrong with a little intuition, because on the other side, if we accept this word relates to this word, we should be able to test that in other ways. So when we get to the Sidon and the Sidonia thing, how come we're in balance now? When we get to the Sidon Sidonia thing, let's stick a. I'm going to stick Lambert's Atrahasis epic under this. That's not what I think of the book.
Actually, Dave pointed out to me that the table was collapsing, and I immediately took it personal. I just recently had to go back on insulin, and it's the catch-22. You go on insulin, put on more weight, And I was sitting here thinking, watching this thing collapse, and I was thinking, is this going to happen publicly? So yeah,
back to the linguistic thing. I just think that academics are kind of like what Richard was saying with scientists. You're so, it's just so ingrained in you that you have to have not only just correlations, but almost like correlations for every point, every thought you think. It sort of requires that intuitions have correlations. And I think it does, I agree with you. I think it does take the spirit of wonder out of what we're doing. A couple weeks ago, I actually was listening to a sermon on Sunday morning. I was driving somewhere, and the guy made this exact point. As soon as you have everything down on your checklist, that you've got everything figured out, boy, doesn't this enterprise become boring. And it becomes boring for the enterprise, not your enterprise. Think bigger, Richard. And I just agree with that. And so, from my perspective, I gave up worrying about my academic reputation the day that I decided to take the contents of ancient texts seriously. But these people were not idiots. They're not low IQ, they're not low thinkers. They had something to tell us. We ought to give them some credit. Yes, they might be speaking in terms of a language we don't understand. But hey, approach it as a linguist does, with the grammar and all the rules and stuff like that. But the text can mean more. They can communicate in other ways. I just don't want to reduce it to rubble and make it mean anything. So what I like to do, if you're wondering what my own approach to all this is, especially when I read with David's connections and his use of the Old Testament and some other things, what I want to see is, okay, here's the trail you're following. Here's the linguistic data that you're using. If we can be secure in what we're doing, with good rules within a discipline, practicing good methodology, to me that allows and opens the door for wondering what else they might have meant. That does not deny what the text says in terms of the rules of language, but that goes beyond it and actually correlates with it.
See, this raises to me as a point, which is about it can mean more. Because we know that the Egyptian priesthood was involved in something called sacred puns. I used to be I wrote a whole play once with nothing but puns. Thank God it is buried in some ancient tell and no one will ever find it. But no, not the Sumerian priesthood seems to have done the same thing, which gets to the whole idea of literary metaphor and allegory and layers of meaning. My main problem with Zachariah Sitchin started when I realized that Zach wouldn't know a metaphor if it bit him in a delicate part of his anatomy. And if you don't read literature as literature, where people have fun with words, even if they're, quote, priests, you're not going to get the full meaning. And so what I admire about David's first effort here, which will get better, is that he's gotten inside the heads of these cultures and he's put together this pattern. And the gestalt, to drag up another psychologist, is it's more than the sum of the parts. And it says there's a connection, a profound connection of the human condition with something that went on up there, not that long ago, cosmically speaking. And as I've said for the last 20 years, either this is completely a boring waste of time, or it's the most important discovery in the history of mankind, and our job is to figure out which is which.
Just to throw out, am I on? Okay. Just to throw out another thought, something I said to Richard a couple days ago. The other neat thing that I've sort of, as I've thought about this, and again, I'm obviously relative to both these guys, I'm a newbie when it comes to this kind of thing. Even though I deal with the ancient world, we're taught again within strict linguistic parameters. But it strikes me that if this is correct, the whole Cydonia thing, even if it's not extraterrestrial, it turns out to be some other, like it was us in some, pre-cataclysmic civilization or whatever. Whatever it turns out to be the source, this stuff screams design. Okay, and as a theist, of course, if you were here last night, I make no apologies for that. But as a theist, I would think.
I can see the poster now. Heiser, this stuff screams design.
No, but it does. I mean, within Christianity, there's an intellectual movement within Christianity called the intelligent design movement. Some of you have probably heard of that. And it's basically being fueled by Christian academics who teach at all the big highbrow universities in the country and overseas as well. And the big thrust is, look, questions of evolution and all this stuff aside, and many Christians would accept that. At the very heart of this, even when you get down to what Michael Behe, who's a biochemist at Lehigh, calls Darwin's black box. A lot of what Darwin said in that era, when his ideas gained some steam, they didn't really know much about the cell. So he calls it Darwin's black box, and he says, look, even something, a unit that small, and the subunits within it, all the way down to its atomic structure, the term he uses is it's irreducible complexity that shows design. This can't happen by accident. And so I think within the Christian community, this ought to be, and I'm not going to claim it's going to be, I hope it's going to be, but maybe not anytime soon because of the association with Mars and some of this other stuff. But this ought to be something that the believing community, Jew or Christian or Muslim as well, ought to be interested in, because in my view, the only way you explain this kind of intricacy, this kind of design, is a designer. It's all back to Aristotle's unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, that every design needs a designer. The whole teleological argument in philosophy. Again, the Christian community would be at variance, or there would be different positions along the spectrum as far as some of the other stuff. Because David's problem is going to be, as he said yesterday, that a person who's Gnostic can listen to his presentation and go, yeah, right on, Dave. Okay, not perhaps paying attention or tuning out the fact that, hey, there were Christians and there were Gnostics in these early centuries. They were opponents, they had debates, there were reasons why there was a division between them. And there's a whole intellectual package in ancient texts, the church fathers, you can go read to follow those debates. The Christian community really needs to realize that Dave is not a Gnostic. Okay? And that's going to be his battle. So I just think that we need to recover, and this goes along with a little bit with what Guy said yesterday. We need to sort of go back to the early centuries, go back to the way they were thinking, try to recapture, as Richard said, Dave is doing, to get inside their heads for what they were thinking and the modes that they were thinking in. Because, again, I know nothing about math, but I know this. To the ancient mind, math meant something. It wasn't just, I got to take up a few hours a week learning this gobbledygook. I mean, to them it was a sacred thing because it worked everywhere in the created world. It showed design. There were deliberate patterns.
But by attempting to explain what you see on Cydonia with words, I do huge injustice to it. I mean, the message is all geometry, and it's all redundancy in math. And what's really amazing is there's the geometric metaphor that's 1,000 times more sublime and powerful than any words that we can actually fit into it. And I think that's what the ancients saw. But that also leads to this conclusion as a Christian, that what we see on Mars is going to the origins of our civilization. The things that the ancients were trying to explain with their languages. And even some of the most sacred symbols, like the five-pointed star, that you reminded me isn't perfect. It's has two long sides and three short.
Indeed, in pyramid, yeah.
Yeah, but it's the image that.
But see, the pyramid was used in that form to resolve five-sided and six-sided geometry. The six-sided relates to the material world. The five-sided relates to biology and consciousness. And so the message in Sidonia, as we've decoded it, was both. It was the inseparability of both. And you're right, that's why we wrote the paper, The Message of Sidonia. The language is geometry. Now, most people, most of you guys, had it beaten out of you when you were in the 5th grade. I'm beginning to wonder if that wasn't deliberate. Because when you divorce people from the real language, you basically cut them off at the knees. They can't ever rise above a certain level. And the elegance of Sidonia is in this geometry. Now, the other thing which is important to remember is that on Earth, this same geometry is called sacred geometry. And I now think we understand why. Because it's the quintessence of reality. It is sacred. It's the language of existence. And that's why Pythagoras, Plato, and all those guys, and the Sumerians, and the Egyptians, in ways that transcend the cuneiform and the hieroglyphs, were speaking the same language about existence. And who was it who said God is a geometry? Because whoever it was, he was right. And somebody is trying to tell us that 35 million miles away and across God knows how much time. Oh, I think it was a little earlier than that. But
Go ahead and ask your question. I'm going to take a chance. I don't know her. She was here at 7:30 this morning when I pulled up. So we're going to put a chance now.
she had Father Donnelly, obviously.
Yes. Well,
So, Mr. Heiser, I'm a recently retired federal government employee, obviously interested in...
We get this on mic? Yeah, we need a hand mic, so this is on mic.
How's this? How's it?
You have to turn one of them off. Turn
okay. Whoever's got the other four, let's turn it off.
Rotate the clock.
You go.
This speaks back to becoming more open so that you can recognize the synchronicity. So my question was for Mr. Heiser. I'm a recently retired federal government employee and interested in learning deprogramming. I've read a lot about
I can help you there.
the language E-prime and neuro-linguistic programming. Do you think those tools are useful in learning to think out of the box, if you will, so that you will be more open to new experiences? You'll be able to recognize them, be more open.
Well, I'm more of a translator and a nuts and bolts guy, so I'm not a programmer. I'm going to need, for me to have a chance to answer the question, I need to comprehend it better. So if you could give her the mic back, I'd like to, just a little elaboration on what, be more specific.
What is your opinion of the usefulness of learning E-prime as a way of thinking out of the box, and the usefulness of neuro-linguistic programming as a way to learn to think out of the box?
Boy, I know one person who is involved in that, and he is the extent of my experience with that. And in a nutshell, he's had limited results with it. I'd like to say there's a substitute for just good old-fashioned rote memory and discipline. And I'm not saying there isn't. I think it could help, but it is not the silver bullet. And that I'm not familiar with. I just have to, the other one I'm not.
Let me take a crack at this. This is interesting. First of all, what is E-prime? I never heard of it. I mean, we had, in the decoding of the geometry in Sidonia, Eero Torenlai, who still is, a geomorphologist of defense mapping, now at Sidonia, and I think it was in the D&M pyramid, David, that there was the repeated expression across the complex of E, which is the classic base of natural logarithms, which is, help me here, 3
2.718, etc.
Exactly. Thank Thanks.
Robert Anton Wilson speaks of it in
His name comes up again.
all of his books. It's
Well, you know, he thinks I'm an intelligence agent. You know, he's written in his books that I'm working with them. But go ahead. I happen to like his stuff. Go ahead. He might. Very good, yes.
basically some of
Yeah.
It is a language without using is, because we can know what anything is, because by the time we address it, it has changed, and by our very interaction in addressing it, we have changed it.
Yeah, but the president said it's all dependent on what is, is. Now, let me tell you what he really meant. Say is quickly. All right, now change it from the short I to the long I. Keep going. No, of course not. I wouldn't do that. ISIS. Precisely. Bill was talking about the mystery schools. If you know anything of our work, you know that we've been tracking the rituals of some of these guys in great positions of political and secular power in this society and in others, both now and historically. We're trying to figure out who knows what, how long have they known it, and why they don't want the rest of us to know it. So when he sat there and said, well, it all depends on what is, that was a code. That's the multi-level higher language. And I can back that up with a lot of other stuff about President Clinton and the current president and his father. But back to your question. You handle the mic back, so this is a conversation, right? I don't think you need either one. What I'm talking about is intuition. It's being open to creative ideas. And for me, the most creative part of what I do is not the stupid checking, which is where the science comes in. It's the recognition of patterns. It's going out to a piece of landscape, you know, the railroad spike on steroids notwithstanding, and seeing things that don't fit, that are out of place. Or, in the words of Lucas, and George Lucas, the Star Wars films are a tremendous lesson in this. Because what the Force is nothing but this same process. It's the same hyperdimensional resonance. It's God leading you, you know, trust the Force, Luke. That's what Lucas, who took that from Joseph Campbell, you know, and the Knights Templar. That's what the Jedi Knights are, of course. I mean, it's all, we're all saying the same thing. So you have to trust the Force, which means you have to trust yourself. You have to look at the world or experience the world in ways that make a difference, so that you're not oblivious. You're not walking through life in a daze, you know. You're not programmed. The whole idea is to get out of programming and to be in the moment and recognize the moment and be able to go, oh, aha, I'm supposed to go and hear Mike or David at 10:30. Well, no, there's something more interesting and important that I should be doing now, and I'll get back to that when I can, because it will be fine. You know, they know what we're about. They won't be bent out of shape that I'm not there on the particular time, because it's part of the flow. It's part of the process. It's why we're here. That's the way I would recommend doing it. Throw out the programs and just get into yourself and have a hell of a lot of fun. Can you say hello on Sunday morning?
Yeah.
Yes.
Did Bill,
Yeah, definitely.
I think Bill has a question.
I had a comment about that too. I thought it was interesting that corollaries all converge back to kind of the Genesis again, where the Jedi Knights of Star Wars thing. Solomon actually had a given name. Solomon just means peaceful, wise man. Jedi Daya was his name.
This guy could do the knobs over here.
I'm more resonant than ever before. Anyway, and the point I was thinking of is that I also try to stress in the book is that there is a constant connection with Genesis. there's a huge disparity then between what you call humanism and the New Age movement and the Gnostic movement, which is basically you're God, you're all you need, and the Christian idea that there is a God out there who has a plan and he has an intimate understanding of what's on Mars too, and that's already there in the Old texts of the Old Testament. And the thing that was really impressive to me was that when you looked at the surface of Mars, you could find every answer in the Old Testament. And that's the thing that I think people are going to have a very difficult time with. That's the thing.
I have a very difficult time with that.
The Christian community is going to have a hard time with, especially because if we discover an extraterrestrial civilization somewhere, even if it is destroyed, it's not like we have to discover everything about them still. You know, what it is that we're discovering is everything about ourselves, things we don't know about ourselves, things about the origins of civilization. So that's the message of Cydonia. And when it comes to the Demon Pyramid, just the suggestion of a five-pointed star, it relates to not only our orientation in space, and only Earth orientation in space, and our obliquity, the precession, all that sacred knowledge.
You know, there is a guy, I don't remember his name at the moment, because it's a whole body of work that I haven't had time to look into, and I think I've been able to look into them. But there is someone who's been presenting me with data for probably the last 5 years, totally separate, who claims that there is an incredibly important processional story coded at Cydonia. And the really cool thing is, it's the same story that David is talking about in this book. And I've known this for a while, and I knew it was important, and I needed to get to it in my copious spare time, but I haven't had the time to really get into it. And I'm also wanting him to be better at exposition, of laying out the case, so that when he talks to people that aren't familiar with this, that they will get it. And it's, if that's true, if that same message is laid out in the ruins there, as you have picked up in the mythologies here, that's telling us something extraordinarily important about this cosmic clock, which gets back to the physics of the solar system and how we're a part of this vibrating, resonant, or dissonant system.
Yeah, I was thinking that the part that most people can't hurdle over is that the same symbols are found in nature. That was the thing that the Gnostics really ran. The facts that you could see the same patterns in the most basic things, organic things on the earth, and then find them out in space when it came to time, systems, chronology. And that's all embedded in the Cydonia plane. And what are you going to do with that information when it comes down in full force? That's what I'm thinking. The future, this sort of thing is going to come out, and it's not going to just be a slight sort of fringe, you know, something that you can play with. It's going to be in our faces.
Yeah, and the idea that the Old Testament language, that the Old Testament story means more than what it says. There's something transcendent going on. Again, not contradicting the face value story, but going beyond it and adding new meaning to it. We're in the same boat.
I can say something. Chris and I probably, as clergy, represent probably about 50 years of ministry combined. We do represent, I think, pretty much mainstream evangelical Christianity. Both of us, what we have in common is an open mind, and we're not intimidated by new things like this. The reason we aren't is because we're totally convinced that what is in the Word of God, the Bible, it truly is God's Word. And so anything that man is ever going to be confronted with, in the heavens, on earth, anywhere, is mentioned somewhere in the Bible. And the same consistency and patterns is in the language, the use, metaphorically, literally, whatever. It's there in the Bible. And so these things are in the Bible. It's just a matter of finding them.
do you think the community minister to, I know Bill has a question, we want to get to Bill. Bill, if you want to chime in here, because I asked you the same question I'm going to ask him now. The reaction of the general church to this kind of thing. I mean,
It's
give us an
shock.
assessment.
It's shock right now. It's shock. It's either laughing or I'd say a shock, which would express itself in a variety of emotions. And awe. Yeah. But I think though that where it comes back down to an understandable situation is when we can go back chapter, text, and verse and show people where these things fit, why they fit, and how they fit. So that offers not only a base of stability to stand on, but it gives you discernment also of where it's coming from and why. And I think that's the job that's on our shoulders and why all of us are here this weekend in Roswell. As Christians, we're trying to seriously address these new things that are challenging the church. Not in fear, not that somebody's going to take away anything that I have. I'm not going to take anything away that I have. But it's believing that this Bible has all the answers, and it's digging into those same consistent patterns to find them. And we're finding them.
Let me ask you a question, because I always wanted to ask this question, particularly you pastors. In the Old Testament, and I suppose you can include the New Testament, there are basically 4 categories of intelligent life forms. There's God, there's Satan, there's us, and there's angels. That's only the 4 you got. So when you, a Christian, evangelical Christian or Roman Catholic, with this stuff, what they have to do initially is to somehow put this in the pattern of those 4 conscious entities. Now, that constrains how you would approach this.
Not really.
Okay.
Problem.
You may not, but I'm talking about the people, as like I said, that you pastor to. I mean, I'll throw this open to anybody, but I just want to know, what if it turns out to be none of the above?
Well, okay, I don't.
Okay.
I can't fully answer it, but I can just off the cuff.
How do we,
That is not
Christian
intimidating.
is happy.
It's not intimidating at all. Well, you won't
And-
make Christians happy,
and-
but it's lining everything up. Again, I say,
Which is the next question. Have we been reading these texts too narrowly, and could we find support, textual support, for broadening the idea that there's more conscious beings mentioned there than we've heretofore recognized?
so first off, when you say angels, there's a wide variety. There's a wide variety of orders of many variations of angels, levels and degrees. Some not even fully mentioned, but only alluded to in the scriptures. But I mean, on that basis alone, what Mike was sharing with last night tied in perfectly with what you're saying.
But I'm not going to scold Richard for not being there either, because we've talked about this later on. There's really two ways that this can be approached. One would be to get the believing community to put this thing, okay, other life form, in the category of many other things that Scripture doesn't specifically tell us about, but that we know are real. Okay, atomic structure, fission, microwaves. Okay, I mean, on one level, that's just a little skip. Okay, with some people, that's going to be, no pun intended, a quantum leap. Okay, but nevertheless, it is a legitimate recategorization of the issue. The other thing about linguistic support, this goes back to, this is just a sentence. This goes back to the idea that the text can mean more than what it says, but not less. If we take, again, just this idea of the language of metaphor that was important to the ancients, the people who composed these texts, and if you're not familiar with Christian theology does not deny the human dimension of the authorship of Scripture. Now, I'll grant you, inspiration is sometimes presented as an event. People want to, God zaps them and they dictate it. That is not orthodox theology. Okay? If you've been taught that, you've been misled. And you need to do some reading. But the idea that it's speaking in metaphor, on that level, I could say, yeah, there is textual support, and that's where this guy comes in. because he's tapping into the language of metaphor and then tying it back into the text in a pattern way, not in an XYZ alphabetic, subject, verb, object way, but it's taking the text and eliciting the metaphors that are there in the patterns. So I would say the believing community has two options there, regardless of what isn't point blank apparent. And we just need to do a little thinking when it comes down to that. I guess we're probably right at the tape change here.
Mason, is that the tape? Do I? Okay.
Does Bill, why doesn't Bill ask his question, then we can go into the answer.
I'm a news guy, and I remember reading last year NASA's global surveyor claiming that they took new shots of Cydonia. This is for David Richard, Monuments of Mars. What do you have to say about what NASA claiming, kind of poo-pooing the reports of the face on Mars and things of that nature?
Okay, it's time to change the tape.
Yeah, but we're going to
All right.
Are you trying to tell me something?
It's the language of metaphor, Richard.
That's the language of the birds. We have until Mason walks back. Okay. Just because I look like I'm in charge, obey Mason. Whatever Mason says, go for this video stuff. Or this time. Okay. Just tell us, Mason. Oh, do we need a 30-second break, or are we ready to go already? Okay. Let us.
Couple minutes.
Just a minute. Well, we're going to continue the question and answer stuff going. I'm going to start. We have to start with.
You need to answer Bill's question about
Right.
NASA's thing.
That's what I mean. Where we left off, Bill had a question. Bill Allner said, "What do you think of NASA poo-pooing the geography, the Cydonia region, et cetera, et cetera?" Richard, it was addressed to Richard and Dave, I think. What we're going to also do, when you get done with that, I'm going to ask a question. Paula Harris's question is next. Did I say it right? Okay, good. And speaking on behalf of the audience, what I'm going to say, or ask you guys, just on behalf of myself and the audience, is we want to see more interaction. We want to see questions, the chance to get it. In a nice way, what we're saying is don't bogart that mic. Pass it around, interact, debate, if you will, but let's try to answer something in 60, 90 seconds, and at least take a breath. If you got to continue again, go with it. But you guys think at a level that a lot of us aren't used to. So you'll understand some of what you say. We won't, but move.
Okay, Richard, you want to?
I think Guy's a frustrated director. Okay, Bill, the question, again.
Question was,
Yeah, Mike, wait for Mike.
I was reading a news report last year, and NASA's global surveyor was basically implying, at least news stories were implying, that the face on Mars was somewhat embellished, a trick, and that they didn't really see anything that significant in Cydonia. Maybe the news reports were false, but I want to get your take on that. And David as well.
Do you believe news reports?
I'm the director of the journalism program at Texas A&M, and I'm a reporter.
Do you believe news reports?
Yes, I do. Not all of them. Some are
Not
false.
all of
Yeah.
them, okay.
Yeah,
That's
I
important.
do a lot of work with media criticism, so I know the problems of the media. Yes.
Do you believe that editors and reporters can have political agendas?
Definitely.
That they can be bought? That they can
Definitely.
be
That's
beholden
hard, yeah.
to special interests?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
Yes.
Then we're on the same page.
Right.
Because the whole story of Cydonia coming out of NASA through CNN, NBC, CBS is replete with intellectual dishonesty in the extreme. Why? Because it's important. We're dealing with, I was telling him a moment ago, I have really enjoyed doing Christian radio. Edition 700 Club, I've done Christian radio. Poor Mike, he's not ready for this. And I have enjoyed immensely those audiences. Why? Not because I'm a believer, but because those people, before I got into the Coast crowd, those people, of all the multiple nonstop. You know, when you come out with a book, hold up book. When you come out, Paula, you're supposed to take a lesson here. All right, hold up the book when you talk about your book. Okay.
Photo op.
When you write a book and you start doing the circuit, you are asked to do umpteen interviews for everybody, which is good. Nobody wants to hear what you have to say. You're in trouble, deep trouble. So I did all kinds of interviews. Little 2-bit radio stations, one-horse towns. I mean, I was on the phone. I lived on the phone, getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning to do interviews on the one coast and then staying up late to do them on the other coast, England, Europe, whatever. The most interesting audience that I had prior to tapping into the coast audience with art was Christian radio. Because, that's why I'm here this morning, because I found out that these people in our society are prepared to think bigger than other people are prepared to think. And I was stunned by this, because my prejudice was that Christians, certainly fundamentalists as the term is, were kind of narrow in their definition of reality. And I was pleasantly surprised to find that the rank and file, not the folks at your level, I've had some really interesting discussions that I didn't want to repeat with those people, but the rank and file, in other words, ordinary folks, are desperately looking for answers. And they had a background of the infinite from which to approach this among all the audience that I was able to talk to. So I really enjoy having at it with, quote, believers. I love the scientific term, believers. It's very nice and neutral and doesn't ruffle certain feathers. But what it really gets down to is how big are you willing to think? Now, one of the cool things that I was able to do, you know, when on those programs I would get people who say, oh, but the Bible only allows so-and-so, so-and-so. My favorite quote was when Jesus says, in my Father's house are many mansions. And I would turn it around and say, what do you think he meant by that? That's not a narrow point of view. A, the many, and B, the mansion part. I mean, think about that. In terms of a metaphor, in terms of a human experience, that means something pretty classy. This isn't a narrow view of reality in the universe and our relationship. It's an expansive view. It's there are more wonders in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy, etc. So that's why I feel very comfortable being up here. And I would love to get invitations to talk to more Christian media, because frankly, I think we've got an exquisite set of questions that need answers, and we need real people who care about the truth.
You're right. You said something really good earlier, that the church, or at least our philosophy, has been limited to 4 possible classes. And just because you pose the question, Chris, what do you think it means by many mansions? After that, Dave, any thoughts on NASA? And also, Dave, I've been asked by 3 people to give you the opportunity to respond to what Richard has said, that your book has some mistakes and it needs some work. And if you have any similar or...
Hey, Monuments has some mistakes and needs some work.
Exactly.
They're always a work in progress.
Exactly. It is the question that's thrown to me from the audience, though.
Well, at this point, we'll be using English. So far, it's been so cerebral that I think we've lost about half our crowd here. But you'll find I'm a little more down to earth. First of all, I don't apologize for Richard not being here. I think he should have been here. And that's why we do these conferences. We've been doing them for years. And we're finally now being heard. And if you were
We didn't let him
to
know
my
that we
message,
changed venues, honestly. We didn't let him know that we changed venues.
But if you'd been at my lecture, I started out by quoting other scriptures. Genesis 2:1, the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and all the heavenly hosts. And that's one category that you seem to have left out immediately. You can't get through chapter 2 of Genesis and be aware of that. And I think that you're going to find in the body of Christ that they are more aware and think in great terms of greater things. I don't think you're going to have a problem with people who are convergent thinkers versus divergent. You're going to find a lot more divergent thinkers because of the possibilities of them staying in the Word and growing in that. One of the the other things I want to say was that you mentioned that Cydonia may be the greatest discovery, maybe this eon. Well, we believe it's Jesus Christ. And that this is just something that was created by him in this universe, because he was the creator of all things. But I want to get something more important. Let's go back to the gematria, because when we started doing this, maybe 6-8 years ago, one of the things we noticed was that we came out with a position that has been unchanged.
Who's we?
Well, Guy, Joe, and I, we have many Christians, in fact, a whole network of web pages, Christian witnesses about how does UFOs and alien abductions fit within a Christian reality. And I have a web page that says testimonies of famous Christians. And you'd be surprised who's all on there. And I get testimonies all the time from Christian leadership. Pardon?
Like, who's on there?
Well, Paul Crouch is on there. You'll find that Bob Larson is on there. We have many personal testimonies of very famous Christian singers and stuff that are on there. And if you go to the website, you can see it. But I don't want to get rabbit trail on that. I want to go back to this gematria point. We have not changed our position that this is spiritual from the beginning. And when we first got into this, the community, there was things they were rejecting. First of all, you couldn't stop an abduction. Second of all, there were some Christians who seemed like they were on the other team, saying that a Christian could not be abducted. We proved that's a fallacy.
I don't do UFOs.
Okay.
What does Cydonia have to do with abduction?
Well, let me make the point.
There's a huge leap there.
Okay, and I'm getting there. We're going to get to the gematria in a minute. And one of the other aspects was that we have watched the ufology community, which you're a part of, whether you're adoption or not.
No, I'm not.
Well, that's what you say.
Yes, that's what I say. No, let me stop you.
I think I have the right.
No, do not,
I've got the
sir,
right.
put me in a box.
Okay.
I do not do UFOs. UFOs are experiences
let me
of
finish
people,
my comment, and then you can decide.
vehicles that
what
come
to do.
here. I am looking at ruins, potential ruins. UFOs have nothing to a first order to do with that.
We have watched the, and I'll take you out of that box if you care to, but we have watched the UFO community change their position over the years. When they started out, they said, this is not spiritual. These are extraterrestrial beings from another planet. And we have watched even to the latest writings of the contact has begun. Now they have finally shifted to a position that this could be spiritual. We have never wavered on that. We think there's a spiritual element. Well, let's get to the gematria.
What does that have to do with my work?
Okay, thank you.
They're not here, I am.
Thank you. When you show us the Sidonian plane, it's obvious this is a religious structure. It's obvious with the Elvis face, the face that there is some kind of worship involved. Because that's the purpose of putting a face there. We believe it's a form. Yes, we believe it's a form of idolatry. Which,
In your opinion.
in my opinion, and I'm talking, so I think I can do that in my opinion. And I think you're going to find that what we see is there is a smack of religion in the layout of Cydonia, and we believe that that means it is spiritual. And our message on that has never wavered. We have always said that what's going on is spiritual. It's more spiritual than physical. And we do believe it's both. And so when you raise up points like, the face on Mars and the Sidonian plane, I see a gematria there that smacks of some kind of religious hierarchy. And I know that it's spiritual. And I appreciate your work.
You said, Richard, do you think
I wanted to ask you a question before you interrupt, Mike.
oh, okay.
Do you think it's
You
spiritual?
stimulated something in my head here. I want to
Good. Do you think it's spiritual?
Depends on how you define spiritual.
How you define is?
Yeah,
Says.
yeah, exactly.
You see, you actually answered this question before.
No,
You
I
do
don't,
see it in terms-
I don't want to be cute. Yes, I do think it's spiritual because I think of all life as being spiritual and physical. I think that it's like C.P. Snow's Two Cultures. He was a very famous literature of the last century. He was afraid that we were drifting apart where ordinary people wouldn't understand science because it has its own terminology, its nomenclature, its definitions, and it's basically when, you allude to the fact that we're talking another language up here, and a lot of people were lost. Well, the whole concept of I lost my train of thought.
Isn't spiritual.
The whole concept of spirituality versus secular reality is a false dichotomy. Because spiritual to me means, is it beyond this reality? When I'm looking at a hyperdimensional physics, meaning a physics of multiple realities, of multiple dimensions, I'm bringing a scientific definition to spirituality. I'm not abrogating my responsibility to look at, is there a consciousness behind this? I'm open to that, but I'm also open to a lot of other possibilities, and I'm trying to winnow them down and get to where we're going to come out. But I'm not into UFOs. This is very important.
All right, fine.
That's
Let's
a
go back to
separate,
the questions.
that's a separate
Did
area.
you hold that position 5, 10 years ago?
No, because the science wasn't there. I have been led to grow, to expand my definitions, to find new knowledge, to seek out new civilization. I have, I'm boldly going, yes. I have gotten better at this. You know, there's a really important part of life when you said we believe and we believe and we believe. Well, if you believe the same thing 5 years ago that you believe now, you haven't evolved, you haven't grown, you haven't been open to the experience. I have grown in this work, and I know I'm not done. That's why I said there are errors in this that I'm continually, you know. We're all a work in progress, and I think, going back to what he said a moment ago, that there are magical mysteries buried in these texts, in the Old Testament, that we're not sharp enough yet to really understand. That we need to be more open and more humble. That maybe we need to grow within ourselves before we can understand what, quote, God was trying to say. That we didn't know it all 5,000 years ago, because if we did, what's the point? It would be boring if there is no change in who we are.
And thank you, because you confirmed exactly what I said. Our
so glad.
position has been consistent. We believe there's a definite spiritual connection. It's the driving force behind it. And you've grown to that position. We said when we started this, nobody agreed with that. But now people are coming around to that
Nobody
position.
agreed. Nobody was talking
We
about
had
it.
hostile opposition. What do you mean nobody? Yes, they were. We had all kinds of dialogues. I've been to UFO conferences all over this country.
This isn't UFOs. This is ruins. This is archaeology. Has nothing to do with little green men coming in spaceships and picking up babies out of their
And
cribs.
you're going to tell me the face of Mars has nothing to do with that, too?
Of course not.
I think Richard has
We
developed
may be able to prove the link at some point, but we're not there yet. That's the difference between science and belief.
I think Richard has a valid point about having to learn something. I mean, 10 years ago, we didn't know it was there either. And we weren't able to debate it. But we are now able to debate it because Richard has actually brought it to us in the vernacular. You know, that was your forte, bringing the information from NASA so that the mainstream could look at it, see it, synthesize it, and look at the points that they might have not been able to see because it is so highfalutin and complicated. But at the same time, you have some valid points that I think maybe in the way you present them can kind of harm the actual process of looking through it to the conclusion. I mean, we can find an incredible amount of details in here that can conflict with the theological ideals and groups of ideologies that, well, maybe we should look at what's really there first. I mean, it's just geometry. You know? It's not saying anything. It's like not the Quran. I didn't find it there, or I didn't find the Bible, or, you know, Bhagavad Gita. It's just geometry. I don't understand it, you know, yet. I'm trying to understand.
A good example of that would be
But
the
I
case of
understand some of
pyramids.
it, and I think we do a disservice to the process by setting up boundaries or you know, lines of demarcation or digging in before we've actually seen everything.
I knew I liked this guy.
Isn't that
To go with
them? You know, if you had these prejudices that you did towards Christian, especially Christian fundamentalists, that is,
I didn't say I was prejudiced.
well, you had a bias.
I had a preconception.
Okay,
That's a difference.
all right.
But I was open to new experience.
And so am I. But I didn't want to, my last statement, which I had to hold on to everything, get a point across, is for you to think that I don't think we should grow and change, because if anything, I'm known for that. So I agree with you on that issue. But I did want to make that point, that there is something going on here on the Sidonian plain that smacks of some kind of religious ceremony.
That's what stimulated my thinking. Do you think that the face is part of a belief system? How would you articulate that?
What we found so far, again, this is a work in progress, and that's the cool part of this, because we don't know it yet. It's like the detective story, where you're looking at the clues, or my favorite reference now, because Robin and I are real fans of a show called CSI, which is this incredible forensic thing, which is a complete departure. I'll get back to that point in a second. I am really tickled that in secular 21st century America, the hottest TV show on CBS, my old alma mater, is a show about figuring things out. And it's so hot they had to copy it and make CSI Miami, which of course makes Robin very happy because that's where she lived for all those years. Anyway, the whole idea of asking the questions is as important as getting the answers. Because again, if you are open to the questions, you grow, you change, you become more. And that, I think, is what this is all about. It's becoming more. So we're at the moment where it's looking like there is a connection between Cydonia. By the way, when we say Cydonia, we mean the whole Mars experience. You know, the whole planet's covered with stuff built by somebody. But Cydonia talks to us because it's got that image, the face on Mars. It turns out that it's speaking much more directly to the Central American mythologies and archaeology, like the Mayans, the Olmecs, because the duality between the hominid side, the human side, and the feline, the pussycat side, is very much there in the Olmec, in the Mayan iconography. When you look at the statues, when you look at what they believe, when you look at their friezes and all that, but we're finding it in the Sumerian. I really love the fact that we found it in Nergal. I mean, he's got this cool thing where the god of Mars in the Assyrian, is it? What? Yeah, well, that's a catch-all.
Right, but
it
passes through all.
Yeah, but how early do we find it? Find it in Sumerian, right?
Yeah.
There's a little what is it? A bas-relief or a statue or something of Nergal, who's the god of Mars, and he's got these two heads, and one of them's a pussycat. One of them is feline, the face on Mars. In other words, this is the most incredible direct evidence that we've got, totally separate from the Judeo-Christian tradition. But then you go to the Old Testament, and you go to the description of the building of the temple, Solomon's temple, and you find the same symbology. Help me here, the lion, Ezekiel 41, okay. I love people who can do that, you know. Just go to scripture, oh yes. But that's where it is. And so we're finding it across all these cultures. Well, to me, that says this is really important. Somebody wanted to make sure we got it, but do we know what it means yet? Now, there may be you may have a definition from Scripture. I would say, do you know enough to be totally married to that definition yet? Or is it on the way to a better definition? Because we need to know more.
Do you see those symbols then as religious or cultural?
Well, when you say religious, I mean, ultimately, when you're asking questions about existence and who are we and what are we doing in this place and where are we going, yeah, those are religious questions, but they're more spiritual than religious. Religious to me is the institution. I am a recovering Catholic, right? Because it was too institutional. It was less about spirituality than it was about showing up. Now, I know that there's this phrase about 90% of life is showing up. Well, the Catholics have made an institution of that. It doesn't matter what you believe. It's just being there in that chair on Sunday morning, or else you're damned. That's not my view of God, well, how small God is.
We all agree.
That's why, yes. Okay, so, well, it's not our side. It's, we're all on the same side here. Because I feel a real resonance with the people in this room that you all want to know more than you know when you walk in the door. And I'm learning some interesting things. I will have left this experience this morning thinking, I know more than I did when I walked in the door. And every time you can do that, you're money ahead. So, yes, it's a spiritual because it's about reality. It's about who the heck are we. But it's not religious. In my way of
The point I want to
thinking.
make, though, is that oftentimes, and I think you've displayed this, is that it's oftentimes for us to see those spiritual, religious things here on the planet, but when we look off planet, there's some impasses. And I'm just suggesting, I don't have that impasse. I see that what your discovery there, the first time I saw it, I knew this was the key to also reaching the church. And I wanted to make one other comment, because we've more or less, in this country, idolized NASA. I know that I heard your voice in that in the past, and I agree with you. And one of the things I want to say is that I personally have been a minister to Haiti. I just got back to Kenya, Africa. I've seen the famines of the world. And I have to admit, it just kind of sticks in my craw that we're sending another $1 billion satellite to Mars to film Cydonia or whatever over the starving masses on this planet. And I have a problem with that. I was wondering how you feel about that.
I think it's a totally false argument. We've just spent how much money beating the hell out of certain people in Iraq?
I don't
There are
agree with that either.
140 wars going on. We are spending, each B-1 bomber is $500 million right there. The quest to go to Mars, which by the way is not to go to Cydonia, they wouldn't dare do that in public. It's the quest for new information. It's the quest to enlighten the species. It is such a pittance compared to the monies we throw down the rat hole for things that we really shouldn't be spending the money on, which is how to better kill people. So if you want to get me into a real discussion between money for NASA or money for the DOD, I mean, the Cold War ended, what, a decade ago? And the Department of Defense budget now is more than it was at the height of the battle with the evil empire. You tell me the sanity in that.
Well, I don't think it's irrelevant, though, to say that why should we take our culture to the stars, which people believe is our destiny, if we cannot take care of our culture here on the planet? So I don't see it as
Because
irrelevant.
we have to do both. We have to do both, and it's not taking food out of their mouths to do what we're doing in space. In fact, I could, probably someday we will do this. I will go through chapter and verse, like that, of how money spent on NASA makes this culture more wealthy so we can do more for the disadvantaged among us. And I can really make that argument, but this morning is not the time to make it more documented with chapter and verse.
I disagree.
I have a question because this is right what I was going to ask. First of all, I have a European perspective because I'm a journalist from Europe, and I can guarantee you that Richard Hoagland is not connected with UFOs. And in Europe, the scientists are studying his work a lot more than they're studying it in the United States. I ended up at his door very curious because the scientists are following his work very curiously, and I have heard Richard on the phone with all people from all over the world doing this research. I see things as interconnected. I was here to cover other stories, and I am so happy you have this panel. I thank you so much for putting this together. This, for me, has been one of the highlights of my visit to Roswell. So I have to give you a compliment here for this. Also, I needed to make that clear about Richard, because when you said that, I said, well, he's never connected with UFOs. But I will say he's in my book because of his research methods. Because I have talked to 25 researchers, and they do it differently, and some of them have preconceived notions. This is the only researcher that I've ever met that spends at least 12 hours a day and gives up eating sometimes because he is obsessed with connecting the dots. And that's the name of my book. So Richard, I did throw in a commercial. For me, it's about connecting these dots, being intellectually curious, and yes, at the end of my book there is a spiritual angle because it goes there. It is part of it. But Richard, I have to ask you, and I've got to get to the question because this is what this is all about. I wanted to make this clear. The European community is sending a probe to Mars. Okay, that I'm in Europe, and that's the European community. Russia, all at once, is sending a mission to Mars.
Yeah.
They've done it before, but this is darn serious. It's going to be in 2004. NASA, I've been to NASA because I did some research there with ground crew astronaut Clark McClellan. The whole thing is commercialized like Disneyland for Mars. And they are very much into Mars. Can you give us some clue as to why Mars is the place where all the money, apart from the money, the focus is going? Is Mars are they thinking of terraforming it? Are they looking at that as a planet where if something happens to this planet, we're going to go? What is your thoughts on why people are really pushing? I'm not talking about Sidonia now, I'm talking about the planet Mars, okay?
Okay. In 1976, NASA sent a spacecraft called Viking, which gave us the pictures that David and I have been looking at, and a lot more. It also carried biology experiments that ostensibly gave us a total negative. There was nothing on Mars. It was dead. It's dead, Jim. Really dead, particularly on Saturday night. And it would have been boring. Now, there's an interesting dichotomy here because we're told in 76, this is what, 2003? That's what, 30, how many years? 27, 20 years? It's over a generation. Yeah, it's a linguist, no math, okay. It's over a generation. If it's dead, Jim, why have we had this incredible program accelerating, deepening, to keep sending spacecraft to Mars? And as you said, Paula, now the European Space Agency, with Mars Express, is sending a mission to Mars. The Japanese in 1998 sent a mission, which by the way they called Nozomi, which means hope. Okay? And the first NASA rover this year is called Spirit, and the second one is called Opportunity, which is supposed to be launched tonight. Cross your fingers. We're building towards something based on the political research that I have in here. Forget the science, forget the linguistics, forget the religious or spiritual overtones, but just based on the politics. What I think is going on is that we have been fed a bill of goods. That the officialdom gets this. Even more important, they get that. They know this is where the money is. They know this is what they're fighting to keep to themselves and don't want you to know is the spiritual, existential meaning of Mars and Sidonia, a la David's work, to what we are doing in this place and where we've come from and where we have to go. And they want to keep it to themselves. They pick your pocket. They pretend that it's, quote, just science looking at rocks and water and whatever. But in fact, they're looking at Mars as the genesis and the place for which they wish to someday return because of the crucial importance of this to the totality of the meaning of life for all of us. And our job, whether we're believers or non-believers or scientists or pastors or whatever, if we value truth and the integrity of the system under which we're living in this republic, we have to use our God-given power under the Constitution to demand that they tell us the truth. And if it means involving multiple constituencies with that common goal, absolutely, I'm 100% for that, and that's one of the reasons I'm sitting here this morning.
I have a question unless somebody else does. Guy or...
With this incontrovertible data on Mars that you essentially have presented in books over the years and everything else like this.
I think it's pretty incontrovertible, but that's what science, no, I'm very serious. Intelligent, thoughtful scholars are or anybody can disagree about the evidence. What I'm really finding really interesting this morning is that sounds to me like there's a body of people that are willing to get to the good stuff, which is what the heck does it mean, and get past this nonsense of is it real or is it Memorex? That we're actually moving the ball down the court to where we get to what's important, which is what does it mean for the human condition? What's it trying to tell us?
And please, ahead of time, I do not want to offend anybody. But is it the reason that this is not getting more media attention, general media attention, and more broad attention, especially in the United States? Is it religious leaders that it's my way or no way, or is it Brookings, or what's really going on here? Because this data, this incontrovertible data, in my opinion, whose fault is it?
Boy, that's a damn good question.
Global conspiracy.
I can give you my opinion, but I've been talking much too much. So let me ask your
No. Okay. Yeah, 3 opinions maybe.
With some of the information that I've got in my literature, I would definitely, and I have, 20 years ago, I was against any kind of concept of global conspiracies. That was for silly paranoids. With many of the information, yeah, I've had to change many things through the history. With much of the information that I've got, I would have to definitely conclude that it's a global conspiracy, and there's a lot of reasons that you and me, we will never know, and we're not going to know, because we will know, but it will never be believed or broadcasted on the air, because prophetically there's a certain conspiracy that is going to be played out of our hands. Now this is where...
Okay. The never part, drop that.
Okay, I can drop that. I can drop that, yeah.
It is their intention, those that
I'll give
want
that
to
to
keep
you.
this secret, that we never know. Fortunately,
Yes.
there are those in the system that feel we have to know. Chris Carter in the X-Files was trying to tell us something profound. Aaron Sorkin in that episode of West Wing a few weeks ago was trying to tell us something profound. What the good news is we have allies in the system that feel we have to know. Now, I'm not quite sure why they want us to know, but I'm sure willing to take their help in getting us to know, and I think we're winning the war. We may lose some battles, but we're winning. I've seen a progression over 20 years. I've been active over 20 years. I've seen a stunning progression. And one of the progressions is we're past the is it real or is it Memorex with certain communities. And what we need to do, what I'm sitting up here thinking of doing, is linking up with those constituencies so we expand the conversation. Because if there are enough of us, and we come at this from enough different directions that are meaningful to us, inevitably, we will know.
I'd like to give another clergy view on this. If you've read Michael's book, in the Facade, he talks about the Divine Council. There is a conspiracy, and it does take place in the highest offices of the body of Christ. And I can tell you that that's not everywhere, though. It's not everywhere, the body of Christ. There are many people that are very open, very receptive to this. And I can tell you that when I first went public on the web, I was one of the few pastors that stepped forward and said, look, we need to prepare people for the fact that when God created the heavens and the earth and all the heavenly hosts thereof, we may be able to have to stop and sit down and consider that the universe is not empty. And, the response I got was amazing. There are people, constitutionalists in the government, the NSA, CIA, Air Force Intelligence. They contact me on a regular basis to keep us informed. They want us to know. So it's not that the information is not out there. It's that the information is systematically rejected. And I apologize on behalf of the church for that. And I personally feel that the church does own the community, our nation, and the people within the body of Christ. An apology for that systematic denial.
I would like to get back to one other thought on the Christian community's response. I'd like to use the Giza pyramids as a good example. The Giza pyramids have no iconography, no writings, no nothing on it. Yet they're always associated with all the, from a Christian perspective, the occult practices of the ancient Egyptians. There's very good evidence that they're not got anything to do with the Egyptian culture. They were probably pre-flood. They have the same consistent geometrical patterns. A Christian who very much loves the Lord, has a radio program, very well known, Dr. David L. Gallerlock, wrote a book about prophecy in stone relating to how this icon of the geometrics actually fits into many prophecies, and actually the title of the book was Prophecy in Stone. There's a scripture saying that the Lord had put something in Egypt as a mark. This could very well be. But yet there's Christians, many around, that will not buy a little pyramid and put it on their coffee table, because it's inherently wicked or evil. My point being that with the Sidonia Mars thing, there's still not enough information. Is this, in my mind, I'm thinking, could this be a sign from God warning us of what the serpent is doing, because there's a serpent connection to it? Or is this a deception from our enemy Satan? Not enough information yet. We need to hold it in a neutral state and wait, pray, from a Christian perspective, pray and seek out our God until there is more information. So kind of putting it in a neutral state until we get the information. But if anything deviates from what we know is the Word of God, then we know that we're headed down the wrong path. So I'm letting you know that right now as far as what's going on. But if it's consistent, this might be a very cool thing.
I have a comment about this, the whole serpentine thing. I want to comment on that and use it as an example of the need to think more broadly. But then also this responsibility, the deliberate rejection of so much information. On the one hand, it's a good example of something that the believing community ought to think about, and is going to have to think about, if Richard and David are correct. Nergal, if they're correct that this is part of the important Sidonian imagery, Nergal was the god of hell. Okay? He's the god of the underworld in Sumerian Mesopotamian text. But now catch this. The connection between the two faces of Nergal and the two faces that Dave showed us on the cherubim in the temple. How do you mesh? How do you resolve that pattern? Okay, that's just something to think through, because you want consistency. You want to honor the data that there are these motifs and these patterns. Why does it show up here, and why does something that ostensibly looks like it belongs in the same pattern group show up in a diametrically oppositional place? I'm not going to say I have the answer to that, because quite honestly, this is just something I've learned here, okay, over the last few days. In other words, to think in terms of the cherubim, the cherubim. It reminded me of something that Adrian Gilbert has in his book Signs in the Sky, when he talks about astrology, and again trying to use that word in a neutral sense, because both Jews and Christians, at least in the early periods of church history, practiced a form of astrology. I know a guy who did his dissertation on zodiac mosaics in synagogues. Okay, it's there. They were very careful to avoid the prohibitions, certain prohibitions of Deuteronomy, and give glory to the God of heaven. And that was the key difference. But inherently, this whole system of knowledge that David is tapping into, they understood this. They understood this, and it had a meaning for them. So that's why I'm saying I think we need to recontextualize these sorts of things. And there's a reason why the image is used here, it's used over here. My guess would be that oftentimes when the Old Testament, or when the Bible adopts pagan imagery, it's for either an apologetic or a polemic point. And I'm not going to say that I know what that is, again, because it's just something new that I have to think about. We'll segue into the whole comment about who's responsible for this. My perspective as a Christian academic is this, and what I'm going to say is not terribly flattering. I think that on the academic level, or pastors have spoken to the lay level, but on the academic level, I think that Christian academics have bought into the myth of academic respectability. That is, if we go get our degrees from universities, and I know lots of people have lots of degrees from lots of universities, Ivy League, Europe, you name it, I can find you somebody that I know that has a degree in something somewhere from one of those places. But the trick is that it's not about who's smart or who's dumb, or who's smarter. It's always about presuppositions and your preconceptions. And mine are very simple. I believe there's a God. Since I believe there's a God, I believe he can actually do something. If I don't, what's the point? And then I have a list of things that I'm quite sure that he's done, because he's apparent from general revelation, we use a theological term, just from creation, this kind of thing. This isn't accidental. It screams design, as I've said before. There are certain presuppositions that go into this, but based on those presuppositions, I'm willing to think along those lines, regardless of what faculty or university scholar or friend that I have who has an XYZ degree, regardless of what he may think, because we're back to the old, if you just stop with what's black and white, you lose the sense of wonder, you lose the interest. And quite frankly, it was just terribly dull to me. I'm a big believer in what I call reimagining orthodoxy. And I don't mean changing orthodoxy. What I mean is, I give the church fathers credit for the positions they've staked out. They were incredible intellects, far surpassing anything we're going to see anytime soon. All right? But I want to see if they've rooted it in the text. And as I see that they have, I know what the boundaries are. I know where the A and the B and the C is at. But how the church has articulated getting to those points, I think in many ways is flawed. And it does not answer questions. You said you're a recovering Catholic. Undoubtedly, you had questions. And you probably had the frustrating experience, I know I did, I'm sure I'm not speaking alone here, of asking questions of your spiritual authority figures, and they were utterly clueless. I mean, they just had no idea, and if they just, you could be perceived as a threat or whatever. I mean, I've already lost one job in academia because I either asked too many questions or I asked my students to ask too many questions. So I've been down that road, I know what that's all about. But I just think that we need to be willing to look at God as being, we need to look at God and what he's produced in Revelation as not being static. Why would we expect the text, if we really believe it, that he gave it to humanity through people for posterity, and he gave us truth? If we really believe this, why would we assume it's so static and so uncreative when he's not? Why would we make that assumption? I just think that we need to, again, everybody operates within boundaries. I mean, science has its own boundaries, at least, again, perceiving where those are. And we need to creatively reimagine how do we get there. I always ask myself this question when I'm doing text work. What does the text allow? What can the text allow? I don't want to violate rules of grammar. I don't want to violate linguistic principles. I don't want to violate principles of semantic analysis. But after all that's done, you're left with options. And sometimes when you get new information like this stuff, instead of just pulling that away from you, you use that language, it just makes you ask different questions. Okay? It makes you approach things a little differently and ask the same fundamental question. Well, what could this mean? How could this have worked? How could God have dealt with this or done this or whatever? And then go back to the text and say, hey, does the text allow any of these things? Maybe I just need to sit and think about it a while and just creatively reimagine how this could have been. I wasn't taught that. I don't know why I think that. But I just have a firm faith that if God is really who we think he is, then it's about time we take him out of the box. And that doesn't mean destroying orthodoxy. Okay, that means getting out of the box, taking a look at the box where the boundaries are, and creatively doing theology, doing text work, so that the box is not only comprehensible and transmittable to the next generations, but it's also intellectually honest and it's defensible.
Let me take a radical, yeah, absolutely, amen. Let me take a radical left-hand turn. I want to know why David Koresh posed such an incredible threat to someone that they had to kill him and his people and all those children in an effort to shut him up. Because what he was looking at and what he was talking about had to do with Revelation and the end times and the ticking clock and signs and connections, although he didn't say it overtly, but connections to the things that David and I are looking at. I found, for instance, that in the real world, the political world, the secular world that we live in part, that during that whole experience, the governor of Texas, who I think was Ann Richards, thank you, just ask me, it's there, had given the head of the Texas Rangers a White House phone number to keep them apprised moment by moment by moment of what was going on with the FBI standoff and all that. And then I found that that phone number was Vince Foster's phone number. And then Vince Foster shows up committing suicide. And we have the whole Janet Reno thing and the gas. And it all went back to belief. What Koresh, whatever you might think of his lifestyle, in fact, within that idiom, that lifestyle was permitted, as I understand it. What was he trying to say that somebody didn't want us to hear? Because it touched on this third rail, which is, what does it all really mean? Regardless of your beliefs, the question itself is not supposed to be asked. And I have no answers. I mean, I have some vague suspicions. I wanted to read, who was the guy that did the book on the experience, because he's a believer? The lawyer, I think, who could talk to Koresh, who did a book afterwards. Anyway, I would go, for you guys to know how to read this stuff, I would go and look at that book again. Because I just have this feeling that David Koresh tripped into something that he himself didn't know he was into. And it had nothing to do with firearms. That was the excuse. It had to do with something that he just fell into that touched something else that's going on. Because we've now found this clock, David and I independently, and Mike's coming up fast on the inside rail, that there's this end times perspective that encompasses this and where we are now and where we're going. And I'm not big enough or have enough knowledge to crack the code, but the folks that you are and who you talk to, you already have that database. So when we bring these two things together, maybe we'll have an inspiration of what that all, because that was bizarre. That should not have happened in the United States of America on CNN. And it's been swept under the rug.
You sort
and
of,
it shouldn't be.
You sort of segue into something else when we get back to it, is that all roads lead to global conspiracy. Like you said, we'll never know in the sense that the media will let it out. You said we will know because we're going to win, because people are coming out. And I'm going to say what's probably could be considered the most trite thing that I think Chris was going to allude to is that the Word of God, we may never know, but the Word of God already reveals it. The problem is, where are the people that will go to God and His Word? One of the most amazing things that impresses me about David is I asked him a long time ago, well, what are your sources? Where are you getting this stuff? He didn't fly a rocket to Mars. He didn't spend a dime. I'm not going to say it didn't cost him. But he just says, well, the Spirit showed me. Yes, he read Richard's book, though. But he just said, well, God shows me this stuff, or God showed me. That's just sort of a light thing I want to mention. And I want to diffuse something that has come up on the UFO community thing, because Richard is an archaeologist. Correct?
Extraterrestrial.
An extraterrestrial archaeologist extraordinaire.
But I have a pulse.
Right.
That's an inside joke.
But as far as the way people are perceived, it's like, I'm not Catholic, but to a Hindu who lives in India, I am. If one person of one race does something bad or good to you, you're going to hold that opinion about many of them if you're a closed-minded person for a long time. Now, in the sense that there's a huge difference, Richard is not a ufologist. or are you foolagist, whichever your opinion is? And I'm probably one of both, and much of us are. But this is a UFO conference. If you're hearing on camera, perception-wise, you don't have to be. I mean, that puts you in the community in the broad perception sense, and that's all.
See, I'm about
We're not-
redefining perceptions.
Well, good.
You know, I think this is a subject big enough to redefine this perceptions. To me, the idea you call this ancient of days, that links terrestrial ancientness, this ancientness, the concept of days, meaning there's a clock ticking. I mean, it was an elegant title. It probably was drawn from some scripture.
It's Jesus.
It had nothing to do with UFOs. UFOs is a 20th century, 1947 definition coined by Kenneth Arnold, or actually coined by Bill, the press, who took his testimony and co-opted it into a trivialized term, saucers, or cups and saucers. The Ancient of Days idea is deeper, vastly deeper than UFOs.
Well, actually, it's the Ancient of Days comes riding on the clouds of heaven. That's Jesus. Let's pop a question. You had your, come on up.
Just to be fair, my name is Will. I'm 21 years old, techno-hippie, do technology. I'm a graduate student. I work on computer science, actually. And what I can tell you is I am actually working on some NASA projects. Basically, what it comes down to is, just like everybody else here, okay, we've all been sent for a reason to talk about stuff. And I just have a little dot, as Paula would put it, to throw into the hat. And I want to get as many opinions about it as possible. Without giving my own opinion, just giving, factual data of what I'm working on. And I'm not authorized to say a whole lot, but what I can say is that, HAL is just about done. Just about done. And partially responsible for this, at least involved in it. So, I have scientific proof, available to me. And so this is going to change everything, and it is the end times. And so without giving my opinion of how it's going to affect us, because of course that would affect y'all's interpretation of this, how is this going to fit into, whoever wants to give comments about this? And this is going to change absolutely everything in probably close to the immediate future. Just let everybody know. That's it. The question is, how is this going to fit into artificial intelligence? HAL 2000, all that stuff.
Artificial intelligence, computers with brains and feelings that can outthink what they're programmed to do. Will they take over the world, rise of machines, etc.? Richard Dolan, excellent UFO researcher, by the way, he has a talk on, he believes extraterrestrials possibly could be artificial intelligence from other planets. It's just interesting theory, but that's all I've got on that. I'll shut up.
Well, Mike Heiser's talk yesterday on what distinguished human beings as being in the image of God. I think the paradigm that intelligence seems to be the overriding one, because I know I used to think that way, and I know that a large part of the theological community thinks that way. So if you're talking about artificial intelligence, I think that was the question that was raised by Spielberg and Kubrick. Because you're looking at this idea that artificial intelligence can someday, just by some deduction, reach the levels that we have in our own humanity. Asking questions, becoming self-aware, having emotions, that sort of thing. That's a possibility. So then where does the individuality, the soul, that sort of thing, where does that fit in? And that's a huge debate for the end times, too. I think it segues into it because then we're asking questions like, is our whole theological structure somehow flawed? And the reason I think the Cydonia Enigma fits into this so well, too, is because it throws huge problems into the theological status quo. You have people who've always thought that this is the only place that really has civilization to the extent that we can think and interact and we have communication with God, and everything outside of it fits in a different sort of qualification. They're angels, or there's something else, but we don't have to worry about it. What Cydonia says is that everything about how we actually think, how civilization has been structured and formatted, how all our philosophies have been designed, somehow were found in these destroyed structures. They were before us, obviously. It's easy to deduce that there was a civilization there that perished before ours did. So I think it all fits together in a sort of a in-time wave. It's all coming together at the same time. I think it's actually programmed that way. And I think, just to finish this thought, there are people who've actually been able to see this coming for a long time, and I'm just now catching up, and we're all just catching up.
I'd like to chime in here quickly. One of my best friends back in Madison, a member of our church, his PhD is in artificial intelligence. He just got a postdoc in genomics, applying that to the Genome Project. And he and I would both agree that since the image of God is not intelligence, this is not going to take away our humanity or that theology. What I'm concerned about, and I know what he's concerned about, and I'm going to follow his work over the next 2 years, regardless of whether we move on or not, when I'm done, is that, in one sense, we're mimicking our Creator. We're doing what we are supposed to do in terms of finding out what makes the universe tick and stewarding it. What I'm concerned with is two things: that it will turn into technology, okay, that we will worship what we create more than the Creator. And I'm also concerned about the potential uses of such technology for manipulation. If you've read The Facade, I do some things with nanotech in there as to how that can be used to manipulate our perception of some things that I think are going to be presented to us in the future. And we won't be able to tell what's real in a biological sense and what's artificial.
I think one of the key things as these kind of new technologies are... You got 30 seconds. 30 seconds, okay. One of the things I think that is in question here is how is it going to change our thoughts or feelings, or where is the discernment? Is this good or bad? To sum it up in preacher mode, heaven and earth shall pass, but my word shall endure forever. Our safety, our security, our discernment is in the Word of God. We will have the parameters to keep us safe, to know what's good, what's bad, where to be in the box or out.
We're on break. Thanks, guys.
That I talked about a few minutes ago. By the way, Chris, I did acknowledge the host. I called them angels, but that's interchangeable, right?
Yes.
So are we talking 5?
Well, actually, I really actually
Talk about
10? I can see this is going to go on for a while. Anyway, how then does that perspective encompass what our researcher friend here just revealed? That apparently at the federal level, there have been, I knew Marvin Minsky, who was the artificial intelligence guy at MIT several years ago. We became very good friends. He stayed at his house. He was tutoring me in all kinds of this, when I was in the museum back in Springfield, all kinds of developing approaches to AI long before it became a household word among certain people. I was very interested to see what Spielberg would do with Stanley Kubrick's vision in the film. I strongly commend that you all go and rent the DVD or the tape or whatever of AI. We've got to see it again, because Kubrick started and Spielberg finished another dense, multi-layered message about really important stuff. Because if one creates true artificial intelligence, everything, the question is it creation or is it allowance? Because in the model of the physics that we're working on, the hyperdimensional model, we're not really up here this morning. You guys aren't really out there. This is all a kind of a virtual reality projection from higher realities that is allowed to be channeled through, I hate that term, gated would be another term, communicated, transmitted, no, revealed. Revealed to me is too narrow. You know, I'm thinking information theory here, which is something that we can talk about. He and I, we're going to actually take this on the road. We're going to do panels all over the country, and we're going to get really cool with this. I have had a lot of fun, and I love the debate because it's in the spirit of good fellowship. You know, we respect each other's approach, but we don't have to agree on everything. And out of disagreement comes insight. It's part of that process, that path. Anyway, back to our friend here. He's telling us that in the wings, HAL, the HAL 9000 that my dear friend Arthur Clarke and Stanley Kubrick projected 35 years ago now, is essentially here. But that's not bad. They missed it by what, 2 years? Not bad. But is it the creation of intelligence or the creation of the matrix, oh, there's a loaded term, for its appearance in our reality? I always used to argue with Marvin that if they were trying to create basically a computer with ones and zeros, it would be intelligent. It would never happen. That what you really need to do is to discover the language, the programming language of intelligence, which is not binary. It's not ones and zeros. It's the geometry here that you have found in the texts, that the Sumerians try to talk about, that even Sitchin, on his best days, has tripped over. I must give Zach a lot of credit, because if Zachariah Sitchin didn't exist, we would not be up here, all right? I tripped over him as I was working on this. The other person that I must acknowledge for me being up here is a guy named Dr. Gene Scott. Anybody know who Gene Scott is? Okay. Gene Scott was on my little television in Berkeley at a critical time when I started thinking the unthinkable about these photographs. And he was doing a whole series. I mean, he was one of the cleverest evangelicals I've ever seen. He comes off as kind of a dumb hick, and he is the smartest guy I've ever seen in the evangelical television community. Because you know why he wears all the hats? No one can figure out why he has a PhD from Stanford. I mean, he's a bright guy. But he wears all those stupid hats because that's the visual cue for the videographers who are racking up the tapes of which sequence goes with which sequence, what he's doing, his teaching plan, his lesson plan. It's a visual aid to his audience and the people doing the tapes. Anyway, he was doing his whole thing on the Great Pyramid. And it opened up so many ideas of the connection between this stuff. I mean, I didn't really know a lot about ancient Egypt at that point. And it was again, one of those things at the right place at the right time, being open to what something was trying to say. Well, you can call it divine providence. You could also call it hyperdimensional resonance. Doesn't matter what you call it. It's being open to it. Anyway, I keep losing my train of thought because it's like a three-legged cat around here this morning. How? Arthur and Stanley were trying to make some profound statements in 2001 of many things that they were telling us about intelligence and about its appearance in our midst and how it would fall in these definitions. I think you're right. I think a lot of the extraterrestrial phenomenology that appears, the UFO stuff, may be part of, quote, an artificial intelligence appearance. Can't prove it yet, but it just has that feel to it. The pattern looks that way. If you're right, if we're about to have that really visited upon us, if, as someone else was saying, there's a tremendous concern now about using this to track each and everything we are all doing. You know, the hyper-Ashcroft model, the super spies where they literally know what you eat for breakfast and what you buy at about what tellers and what kind of car you want to drive and what you're thinking and what your reading habits are and who you like to go out with. And in other words, if this is going to allow in the nanosecond the complete profile and tracking of you, including visual imagery, and I'm talking about taking TV pictures of you everywhere and simply tracking where you go. Enemy of the State is a very good film to show you what that could lead to. Then yes, it's a totally different era. Where in the world of physics, there's a phenomenon called singularities, which is the mathematics of infinities or zero. And we know from our experience base that whenever you get to a singularity, something's wrong. That there's going to be a change. There's going to be a tremendous shift because it can't exist. Zero can't exist and infinities can't exist mathematically. They're not meaningful in terms of physical relationships. So every time you encounter a singularity, it means there's going to be an abrupt quantum shift. We're approaching a sociological singularity from many different directions. I'm beginning to think that this whole idea of end times is not so much about ends, one day we're here and next day ain't, but about transitions to times that are unthinkable for most people because they don't have the references. And what these texts are trying to tell us is beware of singularities because it's going to shift. I've got some surprises for David from the Mayan about the end times and the Mayan calendar. And I need to show it to you, not tell you. In fact, I showed it to you. Do we have time? Yeah. It's stunning because it recontexts the whole idea of the end of the Mayan calendar in a way that's really elegant. And it's going to be a shock to a lot of people, but it doesn't mean the end. It means the end of that mode of thinking. Amen. So if you stay open to that and you ride with it, it means you need to get accustomed to change. And if the United States of America has ever been about one thing, it's been about change. We are the culture of change. I think that's our raison d'etre, our reason to exist as a political entity, to get people familiar with the idea that it ain't always the way it's been, and that change is not necessarily bad, particularly if you prepare yourself, which means you grow, you get better, you are willing to change. And the ride is going to be very, very interesting.
Is there anybody else here about the global conspiracy thing, or do we have a question?
One last one was the Hal thing.
Oh, that's right.
You want to address the Hal thing?
Because we didn't go all the way down.
I'd like to just say that he's absolutely correct. It's probably going to be the most profound revelation.
I can't believe he said that.
Well, that's because I'm a cookie-cutter Christian. But I want to point out that just as there are geniuses involved with AI, there are also geniuses involved with media and in spirituality. They're prepared for this. And it's going to change everything. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And I would say that there are many people who have known this coming for more than a decade. I can remember in 1984 when they announced that they invented the biochip, that the UCLA medical department actually formed a major which you could be a medical doctor and take care of the viruses that may come with biochips. Do you remember this, Richard? And I was involved with that. That was many years ago now. But I'm going to tell you something. This is not news to everybody. And when these paradigms begin to shift, believe me, I believe that the Lord has put people in places to prevent catastrophe. And it's really up to us. The choice will really be up to us how we handle this. And that's why, even in the spiritual community, we need to do things like this and go more public and share these ideas, because we believe that everything we've talked about here today and this weekend is in the Bible. And the only way we're going to reach Christians is with the Bible. And we'd ask you to stop fighting us on that.
There you go. A few cents in here about the global conspiracy. This is something I've never really understood. What I can't understand is how Christians, or again, people of faith, can deny the idea of conspiracy. If you really believe that there's intelligent evil, all that conspiracy says is that intelligent evil is capable of manipulating a few people. Or,
How about stupid evil?
yeah, we've seen some of that too. Yeah, really. But the idea of just manipulating a few people, or using people's fallen predilections, selfishness, the idea of just personal agendas and personal gain, to cooperate with each other. I mean, to me, it's like a no-brainer. I mean, that happens on small scales every day, and everybody can accept that. It can happen within a family. It can happen within a company. It can happen within a university or department or whatever. But all of a sudden, all these little mini conspiracies that everyone within the Christian community would acknowledge exist because of, again, a fallen nature. As soon as you say, well, there's people that are in really powerful positions in the world who know each other and have the same agenda, and they want to either have power or money or whatever. As soon as you say that there are key individuals in points of power, positions of authority, who are doing this, and it's like it doesn't work. I mean, to me, that's just a logical disconnect. Theology aside, I don't get it. And I think, this is my intuition here, this is not something I can prove, but I've said this on a number of occasions. I think I've said it once already here. I think it's because the believing community seems to be, instead of the people most in tune with the idea of the supernatural, we seem to be the least inclined to actually accept it. Because there's just this, almost like this fear factor.
Could you say that again?
The people who,
that was cool.
the people who should be the most inclined to embrace the idea of the supernatural seem to be the least inclined to accept it. Is that okay? But it's just this impression I get that we like the supernatural when it's God and when it's angels, and they're right here with us and working with us. But evil's over there, somewhere over there with the rapist, with the drug addict, something like that. I mean, some just overt form of violence. Maybe it's just media or Hollywood or something like that, as opposed to an active, malevolent intelligence that just wants to collude with people that are useful to a preconceived agenda. I mean, if we really believe this theologically, what's the stumbling block? I don't get it, but that's my intuition.
That's the theology of Hollywood. As I saw The Exorcist. Now I am a demonologist. That's how people think. I saw Damien Omen too. Now I'm an eschatologist. I know what the Catholic, idea of the Revelation. I read Revelation once. Didn't have any clue about it, but now I'm a theologian somehow. And I'm always wrestling with people who don't want to look at the idea that maybe the word church itself actually comes from the etymological root for Circe, the daughter of Helios, things like that. Why are we always using these words that actually don't really mean what we think they do?
Well, it comes from circle. Circe is circle. Circle means a cycle, the repetition of a pattern. That's astronomical. That's back to the things that Mike's beginning to sense about precession, about cycles of history and consciousness of human experience. The church should be connected to looking at these patterns. And that's why I didn't leave the church. The church left me. Because I wanted to continue to look for the patterns, and they were not interested, the folks that I talked to. They had their dogma, and don't confuse me with facts, particularly new facts.
In Christian circles too, you come against the idea that hell is somewhere in an abyss underground somewhere, or another ethereal sort of idea. But the biblical text says it actually exists in the atmosphere around the earth, or extends outward from the earth. That's where this spiritual battle takes place. And the devil hasn't been deposited somewhere, and his angels haven't been deposited somewhere, so we can just, we don't have to worry about it until we die and go to hell. He's around already doing his thing, and in a very dynamic way. So to get past these things that people have already preconceived because they've been taught this, nothing seems to be more sacred than a long-held belief. And I marvel at these ideas that the devil has, a forked tail. He's red and he's a hobgoblin. He makes people's heads spin. When in fact, if you look at what the Bible says, he taught people. He showed people things. He was Gnosis itself. And so from that Genesis, I think it's very interesting to look at what's going on around us right now, because he also talks about time. He also has a concept of time. And Chronos is a huge part of the Gnostic belief system. To understand how time works in the celestial sense, where I'm getting just a slight beat on how that celestial chronometer works, where we're actually moving into right now. And there's a couple things I want to discuss with Richard, because of the astrophysicist stuff I have no real good grasp of. It's getting pretty heavy, and it's getting heavy really quick. So,
It's not coincidental.
no.
That's the interesting thing. When I read his book, he doesn't know yet some of the things that we know we haven't published that synchronistically match the chronologies, but give us the reasons for why this keeps happening again and again and again. And I've been very careful not to even talk about it until we could substantiate it. And what you've done brilliantly is to begin to document that there's a knowledge base in the myths, in the texts, from all these different cultures that is converging on the same thing. And that's powerful. That's incredibly powerful, and it's a message that needs to be spread to a larger audience.
Robin has a question.
I wanted to
Mike, where's the portables?
Just walk up.
I wanted to make a comment about what you were saying about conspiracies. And I think what enables conspiracy is the fact that people don't want to go outside of their comfort zones. And when they're forced to re-examine everything that they have lived with and take it to be fact, it's a very threatening experience, because if suddenly you find you don't have to be sick, there are other reasons for things that happen that can be changed, and that things continue in that manner because it's economically profitable. The industry of health, the industry of medicine, our origins. I mean, it's across the board that you don't have these things, but basically it amounts to taking responsibility for yourself, starting there, and then it can spread out. It's not easy, but ultimately you should really care about yourself and getting yourself well in all aspects, body, mind, and spirit, and then make a difference. That's
Yeah, I wanted to jump in here because Guy tells me it's in 20 minutes and we're closing down. And I want to go back to, my questions are for Mr. Hoagland, going back to your opening comments.
Do I need to respond to that?
I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't want to.
Okay, and it's taking you back to your opening comments. You said something about never having been to Roswell, not necessarily having an interest in coming. Is it because of our UFO profile that maybe you were never drawn to come here? And I have 3 questions, and I want to batch them because he won't let me get up and ask questions again. So that's one. The second is, you said that when you went out to the crash site, you saw things that others had not seen in 50 years of making visits out there. I'd like to know what that is. And then my third question is, would you please define the term archaeoastronomy, which I believe is a new term, and what its place is in all of your work, and what its importance and future bearing.
Are you a reporter?
Yes.
How could I know?
Deanna Cheney, FYI Magazine.
You're working for whom?
FYI Magazine.
Oh, okay.
Local.
Okay, excellent. All right, let me start and go back assward, as my grandmother used to say. Archaeoastronomy is a contraction of 2 words, archaeology and astronomy. It's just the idea that in archaeology, the last, 20 years or so, starting with Gerald Hawkins and Stonehenge. I'm not wearing my little Stonehenge thing this morning. He discovered there were astronomical alignments to the stones. that whoever built Stonehenge had a degree of mathematical and geometrical knowledge of the heavens that was, for that time in the 60s, 65 is when he wrote Stonehenge Decoded using the big UNIVAC computer at Harvard, that was a phenomenon. I mean, they thought, oh, these were these barbarians running around with bear skins and clubs and yanking and women out of caves with their long hair. No. Now we know that the geometry of Stonehenge, through the work of people like Carl Monk, is the geometry of Sidonia, is the geometry of the pyramid, is the geometry of Mesoamerica, is the geometry of the stuff in Thailand, Angkor Wat. It's worldwide on this planet. It's the geometry of the Indian mounds. It's the geometry of I'm trying to think of the stuff in Northern Europe. It's all over. And it's not just on this planet, it's here. It's the same geometry. It's this sacred geometry because it's the geometry of the physics between dimensions, between realities. A real physics of other realities, which to me is a stunning spiritual physics statement to be able to make and support. When we go to the first question, well, let me take the second one. What was the second one again?
What did you find?
Oh, what did we find? Are you kidding? I'm not going to talk about that yet. You're going to be kidding.
Tune in sci-fi.
I'm not going to talk about
That's a
it
quick answer.
until we can document it. And because of all the agents that are sitting out there from the NID and the CID and the ADA and the DIA,
MOUS.
the last thing I would do is to tell them what we found so they can go and destroy it. This is a war between knowledge and suppression.
Those of you that live here can suddenly see all the helicopters.
And we found out last night that this stuff is on public land, on government land, which means they wouldn't have to get permission from anybody to simply go and do whatever they wanted to. So no, I don't believe in secrets. I hate secrets. I have had to learn through bitter experience over 20 years that sometimes, as what's her name said, the poet, oh, come on, help me. The one I always quote that I can't think of this morning because I haven't had breakfast. Not my grandmother, no. No, very famous New England poet. She used to say, tell all the, Emily Dickinson, thank you, dear. She used to say, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. To me, the way you preserve truth in a hostile environment where there could be stupid evil is you are cleverer than the evil guys, and you tell the truth, but in ways that it takes firm root and it cannot ever be suppressed. So you just have to get more sophisticated about telling the truth.
First question.
And the first question is, why do we never come to Roswell? Do I find it boring? Are you kidding? It's not relevant, or it wasn't relevant until relatively recently to my search for how these things got on the planet Mars. The more I pursue the terrestrial connection, the more linkages I found, the more documentation from people like David that confirms my terrestrial connection ideas. And the more numbers that show up in the Roswell experience. For instance, let me give you one classic one. The physics is cornerstone in Sidonia on a key number, 19.5 degrees, which is actually the rounding up of 19.47 degrees. When did Roswell happen?
Question?
Now you can hear me? Don't tell me. I have a surprise. I wanted to come up here and thank all of you for being on this panel. The brain power here, the focus, the education, people like you make all of us start thinking, and that's important in our society today. And Richard, Chris is my little brother, and I don't always agree with him, but I support him. Let's give everybody.
I don't know if it was said earlier on the video, but as Paula Harris, international journalist and author of Connect the Dots, said, As an international journalist who's here covering Roswell, she thinks this is the most important and best thing she's seen in Roswell all weekend. Walk up in front of the camera, Paula.
Okay, this is Paula's book.
Yeah.
Everybody's got to read Paula's book.
Yeah.
All right? And here's Paula.
And especially Richard and Mike, the Bible says that the wise man craves correction. Thank you for continuing this beyond my best intentions. We'll be taking just a break soon.
Can I add something?
He is going to give
Really
a 5, 4,
quickly?
3, and
Yeah.
you've got it.
Yeah, okay, really quickly. The reason being this, exactly what the lady that was here that just spoke, Chris's sister, said. It is important for me to be a thinking human being, and I need to have intellectual stimulation. And the intellectual stimulation that happened with this panel was absolutely incredible. May I encourage Roswell to have a world symposium with people from all over the world, so that you can have flags from all over the world and make it a serious situation where ideas become connected, where people can share ideas. And this is also on a spiritual level from everywhere, so that we can all walk away with this gift. Because I feel very, very bad that there shouldn't be many, many, many more people here this morning. Okay, so may I encourage you to look at this, okay? There's a possibility.
I'll talk to the mayor tomorrow.
I guess with that, we're officially over, but I would like to do a kind of a pastoral thing. I hope you guys don't get really nervous about this, but I would like to close this in prayer. I think we're all here because we want to know truth. We want to know what is really real. This is basically a biblical conference, so we believe that the truth is Jesus. But we need to know maybe the truth about things on Mars, since that's our topic today. So I would like to close with a prayer asking our God to lead and direct all of us to that truth. Is that okay with everyone? Thank you. Father, we thank you for this weekend. We thank you for the people that you've drawn here, those that are inquired, those that have been inspired. We thank you for the pioneers, Lord, that have been boldly able to get out of their safety zones and proclaim truth, or stand for what they understand as truth and what they're seeking as truth. So we come to you, Lord, our Creator, in the name of Jesus. And we ask that you'll show each and every individual that's here today the truth. The truth in their life, the truth on Mars, the truth in earth, the truth in their hearts. We thank you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Nobody else. My own used to say, et tam missa est. It means now the Mass is finished.